Our Hebrew Bible reading this morning comes from one of the lesser well-known prophets. Joel is not an Isaiah or a Jeremiah. Not as people are familiar with the prophet Joel. But the message that Joel has for us today is consistent with the messages that we do get from some of the better-known prophets. Joel is writing at a time when his people have been through not just one tragedy, but a series of tragedies. War, occupation, famine. The list went on and on. Indeed, the Jewish people came close to being annihilated during this time period, lost to history. But they weren't. They've remained. They've held fast. And after this long period, decade after decade of extreme difficulty, Joel has this new message, a message of hope. Like all prophets, Joel is forward-facing, not past-facing. And his message is that a change is coming for his people. A pivot point is coming. God is going to deliver them. And although they've been in this low, difficult place for many years, soon they'll be sort of pivoted up into a much better state of life, a more comfortable and secure and happy state of life. Out of sadness will come joy. That's the message that Joel has for his people, and therefore that's the message that Joel still has for us today, that this big pivot point is coming. And ultimately, of course, the prophets, when they talked about this hope that was coming in the future, they weren't just talking about their people. Their message was ultimately for all of humankind, that there is this pivot point coming, and it was a sort of worldwide or even cosmic pivot point, the day of the Lord, this coming decisive action by God that would take a world from a state of suffering and brokenness and disarray into joy and healing and unity. Now, I think hearing this message today can bring a mix of emotions. On the one hand, it's wonderful to hear this message of hope. In many ways, of course, we need this message just as much today as people did 2,500 years ago. There are lots of things to be worried about today, right? And this message that God is at work, that God is preparing this pivot point in the future for the restoration of the world is wonderful to hear. But on the other hand, Joel was prophesying about 2,500 years ago. And we've been waiting, and we've been waiting, and we've been hoping, and we've been suffering. And still this great pivot point hasn't come. This message can fill us with hope, but I think it can also fill us with frustration. How much longer, Lord, must we wait? And this is what I was reflecting on this week. What are we supposed to do as we're awaiting this decisive cosmic level pivot point? What are we supposed to do in the meantime? And this got me thinking that maybe we need to be paying attention not just for the big pivot points, the worldwide pivot points, but also the more local, the more personal pivot points. Maybe there are pivot points happening in our own lives and in the lives of our families and friends and our communities. Yes, we want the big cosmic pivot point when everything is made new, but maybe there are opportunities each day, each week, each month for smaller scale, but still significant pivot points. And maybe we need to be paying attention to those now, instead of just waiting around. Now, it just so happened that as I was reading the prophet Joel and I was reflecting on this and trying to make sense of this, I was also reading a very different book this week. Some of you may be familiar with Cori Bush. Some of you may not be familiar with her. She's a congresswoman from the state of Missouri, the first African-American woman congressperson from Missouri. She represents the 1st congressional district in the House, I believe. And this is her memoir. It's called The Forerunner. And I found out about it this week and I started reading it because I read a review of it and I got really interested in her story. Now, what I'm interested in this morning is not her current career. I'm not interested in her political views or any campaigning she's doing. And just to be crystal clear, right, St. Augustine's Episcopal Church does not endorse any candidate for any office ever. No, what interests me this morning is her story. This is a memoir. Tells her story from the past to the future. What I'm interested in is understanding how Cori Bush got to where she is today. And if you end up reading this book, you'll find a pretty extraordinary story. I can't say everything in the few minutes I have this morning, but there's a lot to learn from Cori Bush in this memoir. But in particular, I found myself paying attention to the pivot points in her personal story, right? As I was reflecting on Joel's promise of the big capital P pivot point, I found some examples of smaller pivot points in her life. Now, Cori Bush grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, and her early life was sort of happy and secure and good. Her family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. She never seemed to want for anything. She had some good friends and a loving community and a loving family, father and mother with her, supporting her. And indeed, at an early age in elementary and middle school, she showed an extraordinary aptitude for academics. She wasn't just good at school, she loved school. One of the things she talks about is how excited she was when she first got homework. Okay, now how many students do you know, even gifted students, who like homework? There's not many. She enjoyed homework. She really loved academics. In particular, science seemed to have interested her. And so her early life was one of such potential and promise. And knowing what we know, right, where she ended up, some of the things she's achieved, this makes sense, where we see a young person with extraordinary potential and promise, and we see someone who ends up in Congress, and we say, hey, that makes sense. But the reality is there was a big valley between the early life and where Cori Bush ended up later on. And one of the big pivot points of her life was when she first went to high school. She applied to a private high school. She went to private Roman Catholic schools for all of her early education. And she applied to this Roman Catholic school, and there was an entrance exam. And she took the exam. And she waited a few weeks, and then she got a call from the principal saying, I need you to come in. There's a problem with your exam. Now, it's worth pointing out that Cori Bush, her elementary and middle school experience was in majority black schools. This school was different. It was a majority white school. The vast majority of the students were white. But anyway, she showed up to the principal's office to hear what the issue was with her exam. And what the principal told her is, look, you scored the highest among any of the applicants. You had the absolute highest score. And she thought, okay, but you said there was a problem. Well, and here's where the rub was. The principal and the other teachers and administrators just didn't believe that a black student could have the highest score on the entrance exam. It was that simple. And they assumed that she had cheated. They had no evidence that she cheated, but she must have cheated, because how could a black student have the highest score when there were so many gifted white students taking the same test? And so they said, if you want to get into school, you've got to take the test again, and this time alone, with no one around you. There's no possibility you could cheat. She said, fine, great. She took the test again, and this time her score came back even higher. So, of course, she hadn't cheated. She had achieved that excellent score. And of course, knowing what we know about her early academic life, this shouldn't surprise us. The fact that it did surprise those white teachers and administrators, there was a telling sign. It was a foreboding omen of things to come. Because as she spent their first few weeks as a freshman at this high school, she found herself not only facing some hostility from many of the white students, although not all. She does recount some of the students who befriended her and were kind to her. But that's not unusual in that circumstance. But what really troubled her was that she was receiving bad treatment from her teachers. Her teachers would mock her, and they would speak to her with a hostile tone. And there was one event in particular where she went into class and her teacher said, Cori, you didn't turn in your last assignment. I have to give you a 0. And Cori was confused. What are you talking about? I did turn that in. And as they were discussing this, she looked down at the teacher's desk and she saw the assignment on her teacher's desk, and she just pointed to it and said, it's right here. And she tells the story. She says the teacher looked down, realized that she had accidentally left the assignment out. She tore it up in front of her, threw it away, and said, you're lying. You didn't turn it in. She got a 0. Now, this situation was totally new to her. She didn't understand what was happening. But even at the age of 14, she thought, yeah, I think race might be playing a role here. So she went and talked to some of the other black students at the school. There weren't a lot of other black students, but there were some. She asked them, are you getting this treatment? Is this stuff happening to you? And the strange thing was they said, no, we're not having these problems. Overall, we're comfortable here. We feel good here. It's really strange. What's going on? And I don't know if she ultimately realized it in that moment, but eventually she realized that the issue was a mix of her race and that test score, right? The teachers at her school, who were all white, were fine with having black students in their school. They were fine with black students as long as they were average students. But the idea that perhaps the smartest, the best student at the school was a black student, they couldn't accept that. They could accept black students in their midst, but they couldn't accept the black excellence at their school. That was the issue. And so they were trying to drive her away because what she was doing, what she was achieving didn't fit the narrative they had about race and about intelligence and about academic aptitude and achievement. Now that moment where the teacher tore up her assignment and threw it away, that was a pivot point in Cori Bush's life. But of course it was a negative pivot point. Something changed within her. She reflects in the memoir that something changed in her that day. She was so shocked and taken aback by this treatment that here's this person, this professional, who's there to train her and educate her and support her and nurture her. And this is the way you're treating her. Going into high school, she had a lot of self-confidence, justifiable self-confidence in her academic ability. Going into high school, she had a strong sense of her self-worth. Her family loved her, her friends loved her, her teachers had supported her. But that day, that sort of was broken. Her self-confidence and her sense of self-worth was broken. It was a negative pivot point. She'd been flying high for her early life. In this moment, she was brought low. She didn't understand, couldn't comprehend what was happening there. Now, soon thereafter, she left that school. Her family supported her in just getting her out of that toxic environment. She ended up at a different high school that had a majority black student population, and she completed high school on time and graduated. But that sort of straight A student was now more like a C student in high school. Something had changed. She lacked the confidence to continue to achieve at the level that she definitely could. And this change in her self-confidence and her sense of self-worth wasn't just academic. As she began to date at the age of 14 and 15 and 16, she found herself in relationships that were dysfunctional. I'm not going to go into detail here for a number of reasons, but Cori ended up facing multiple events of violence from her partners. If you do read the book, and I recommend that you do, just be prepared for frank descriptions of violence by men against this woman. She found herself in these dysfunctional relationships, and she found herself unable to navigate her way out of them. She just didn't believe she was worth fair treatment. She didn't believe that she could have a healthy life, academically, personally, or in any other way. And in her mid-20s, she ended up working a job at a daycare, doing important work that she liked, but getting paid very poorly for it. Every month, facing bills she couldn't pay. She was eventually evicted on 3 separate occasions. Here was this person who had such academic ability, but by her early 20s, she's really struggling. That pivot point at high school took her from flying so high and brought her so low. And this is a reminder that although we might be waiting for that sort of big pivot point in the future in a good way, pivot points can work either way in life, right? Cori Bush found herself in sort of this deep trough of life, this very difficult time that went on year after year. But the good news for her, and I think ultimately for all of us, is that her story doesn't end there. In her late 20s or early 30s, she was still working at the daycare facility, and she was still getting paid just above minimum wage. And her boss, who is also her pastor, interestingly, her boss came to her and said, look, I'm never going to be able to afford to pay you what I know that you can make. And I can see your intelligence, I can see your passion, I can see your skill. And her boss recommended that Cori pursue a career in nursing. Her boss had actually been trained as a nurse herself, so she knew about the field. And she could see that Cori had all the right skills and abilities to be an excellent nurse. But she didn't just recommend, hey, I think you should be a nurse. She wrote her a recommendation letter, found her a school nearby, and sort of pushed Cori to apply. And crucially, of course, the real crucial thing is that Cori Bush, who had lost her confidence, lost her sense of self-worth, she said yes. She took that risk on herself. Now, surprising no one but perhaps herself in that moment, she excelled. Completed her nursing program with multiple awards, got a job immediately out of school, and indeed within a year or two, was serving as a floor supervisor of her nurse unit at a hospital in St. Louis, or in the suburbs of St. Louis. So this was a second pivot point in her life. She spent so many years struggling, and this one person noticed her, supported her, nurtured her, gave her an opportunity and a little bit of push towards that opportunity. And all of a sudden, she pivoted from this deep trough of life up to this high point again. You know, she's getting paid 3 or 4 times what she made before, doing really important work that she valued, and again, building her skill set. Now, her story, of course, doesn't end there. There's a whole lot more to say. Cori Bush was one of the sort of central activists in Ferguson during the protests after the murder of Michael Brown Jr., for example. And of course, we know she went on to run for election, although it took her 3 tries to actually succeed. But it's these 2 pivot points in her life that caught my attention this week. Reflecting on the prophet Joel and reflecting on Cori Bush's life, it was those pivot points. At 14, that low pivot point where that racist teacher brought her down and destroyed what she had been building. But then 15 years later, where someone else came along and nurtured her, supported her, and lifted her up. These 2 pivot points in her life were crucial. They were crucial. We need to be paying attention for these kinds of pivot points in our lives and in the lives of our friends and family and neighbors and coworkers and other members of our community. Some pivot points will be negative and some will be positive. And if we're paying attention, right, hopefully we can avoid the negative ones or at least soften the blow of the negative pivot points. Meanwhile, we can be aiming for and amplifying the positive pivot points, again, in our lives and in the lives of those around us and who we care about. And I found myself wondering, what if her story had been a little bit different? What if at that high school, there had been just one teacher who saw what was happening to Cori and went to her and explained, look, I see what's happening, and it's not your fault. You're doing everything right. And you're smart and you're capable. Don't listen to what these teachers are doing, and I'm going to support you the best I can. How might that have changed her experience in the next decade and a half of her life? Or imagine that her boss had not decided to stop and encourage Cori to change paths in her late 20s or around 30. Imagine that she hadn't written that recommendation letter. Or imagine that Cori had just refused to say yes to the advice. There are pivot points in life, but we have to pay attention to them. We have to respond to them. We need to make sure, as I said, that we're trying to avoid the negative pivot points and aim right for the positive ones. The prophet Joel reminds us today that God is waiting and working and preparing the big pivot point, promising this day of the Lord, this radical moment of restoration for the world. But in order to get to that moment, in order to be ready for that moment, we need to be paying attention to the small personal pivot points in our daily lives. A little bit closer, more ready for God's decisive change. So I ask you today to reflect. What have been the pivot points in your life in the past? What have been those decisive moments, positive or negative, that have shaped your story? How might have things been different for you if someone else or you yourself had made a different decision here or there? As you reflect on that, I encourage you to simply keep your eyes open, pay attention to the pivot points that you are approaching and that your friends and your family members are approaching. Try to help yourself and others avoid those negative pivots and aim right for the positive ones. That's part of the work that God is giving us to do, I think, as we wait the big capital P pivot point. So let's have our eyes open and let's stay vigilant. My friends, may it be so. Amen.